Hi and welcome. My name is Jinesh Patel. I'm the CEO of Foresightly.io and the owner of Business Automator here in the UK. I've put together this presentation about Power BI connectors. Hopefully you can hear me because I'm kind of a bit bunged up at the moment. I've got a cold at the moment. I'm trying to get over. Um, so I put this presentation to explain what the various options are when it comes to extracting data from APIs and what the actual scene is in with regards to connectors for Power BI. So at the moment, you've got some inbuilt connectors that you can access. So within the Power BI desktop tool, you've got some ready-made connectors developed by the Power BI team. So like Facebook, Google Analytics, Mailchimp, and so on. And these work great because they work really well with Power BI serverless and direct query. So everything works beautifully between your report refreshing and extracting that data from whatever the data source is. However, there are some issues that I'd like to raise when using these inbuilt connectors. Like firstly, the actual data that you can access is defined by Power BI. So if there's a particular data set or endpoint within the end application that you want, for instance, say it's like Google Analytics or Mailchimp, you want some specific endpoint and specific bit of data, you won't be able to get it because these are kind of closed off connectors that you can't access, and also you're limited to what Power BI provide you. So if you wanted to access some data from any other app from this list, then you wouldn't be able to do it. So what's the solution? So option one, you can buy third-party connectors, and I've done that before, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail. Or you can build, option two is to build your own connectors. So I'll go to that as well. So let me go option one. So in option one, when you buy third-party connectors, there's two general variants. You can either install drivers to your local machine, and these usually come in the form of like ODBC drivers or ADO.NET drivers, and there are various different types of drivers written in different code, but effectively you install these to your machine, and then that driver itself will then make API calls, pull that data from that application that you're calling from into your local machine, and then provide that data for you to actually create your models off the back of. You also have SQL Server integration services, so SSIS components, which is like their ETL tool, which you can also use. But with that tool, you need SQL Server license, and you also need to know how that actually works and actually build the entire to build the actual component itself. There are components that you can buy off the shelf for SSIS, that there are certain vendors out there that will provide you. So those, I don't want to knock them. They're perfectly fine and they work a lot of the time in a lot of circumstances, but I'll explain why I've got issues with that shortly. The other option is cloud-based ETL tools. You might have come across these like Blendo, Data.World, Stitch. There's quite a few of them, and again these I have issues with as well, and I'll go into. So let me just start off explaining the issues I have with ODBC drivers. So pros are they're quick to get going, and I put low fees as a con. It should actually be a pro because low fees is definitely a pro. So quick to get going, they're cheap. However, the cons are that ODBC can be buggy and prone to failure. I don't know if you've actually tried out these type of drivers before. They can be quite buggy, and they don't play nicely, especially when you load multiple connections within a PBIX file. It I don't know, for some reason refreshes always have problems. I always seem to have problems with refreshes when I use ODBC drivers. If you're using SSIS, you might need some additional licenses as well, which is an additional cost. You're only limited by what's on offer by the vendor, by the third-party vendor. So if you need to access some particular data set from a particular application, then it's not available, then what do you do? Also, the other thing is where you've got applications that actually use REST API or Auth2 authentication. This is where, like, you've probably seen it, like, you want to access some data from application, a pop-up window appears, and a user has to log in effectively and grant an application access to the data. Now, with these type of drivers, the pop-up pops up on the local machine. So if you're doing a report for yourself or for your company, then that's fine. You can just log in there. But if you've got multiple users or multiple clients, you can't expect your client to, remote into your machine and give you access. That way, it's probably not something viable, I wouldn't have thought. So those are the flaws, in my opinion, about ODBC and SSIS drivers. Now, the issues I have with cloud-based ETLs is they can be quite effective in loading all the data you need into a single data set. So when you have a single data set within a PBIX file, the refreshes tend to work much better. They tend to have issues where you have lots of different connections within a PBIX file that the refreshes can have issues with, especially when you're pushing stuff to the service, Power BI service. However, the biggest thing with ETL tools is they're really expensive. And again, you're limited by what's on offer. So there's this blog here which I found, which I just show you. It's written by Panoply. Is again another one of these ETL tools, and if this is something right for you, then go for it. Have a look at it. But you can look at the different types of ETL tools out there. $2,000 a month, $900 to $15,000. Talend. These are expensive tools. They're not cheap, and especially if you just want to access a bit of data from an application, forking out this kind of money, it's in my opinion, it's not sustainable. So I just want to come back to the issue about ODBC. So if you do decide on the two options, whether it's locally installed ODBC drivers or cloud-based ETLs, for me, probably if I had to pick, I'd have to go with the ODBC option, the ODBC drivers. Now, this is how they work. So you've got your Power BI desktop here, and then if you want to push things to Power BI service, what you need to do is, for these ODBC drivers to work, you need to set up a gateway. So how the gateway works is when a refresh occurs within the Power BI service, like on a schedule for instance, that will initiate a trigger to fetch data, and that will basically go via the gateway to your local machine where your PBI desktop is installed, and then in step 2, the ODBC driver itself will make the API call to, say, an app like HubSpot for instance. The data will be returned into your local machine and then passed back through the gateway to service. Now, if you look at this, you can, if you look at just in terms of like what the flaws and issues are. Firstly, like if you have multiple connectors within a PBIX file, then it only takes one connector to fail for the entire refresh to fail, and this can happen quite often, especially if you hit API call thresholds. So it just takes one timeout or one kind of error message returned on your API calls to break the entire refresh. Also, if you've installed a Power BI, if you install the gateway on a local machine, that local machine has to be up all the time whenever you're doing your refresh. So it's completely dependent on that local machine, its resources, like its memory, its processor speed, and simply from a system design point of view, it's quite a bad design because you're presenting a kind of a key point of failure effectively. So something happens to that your machine locally, the refreshes are just going to break. So what's the solution? So the best thing you can do if you're going, I guess, down the gateway approach, is to try and get all your data into a single data set. So either store it in a SQL database, and that way, when you load the data into your PBX file, it's only connecting to a single data set. You can then connect with direct query as well, or you can import it, and you shouldn't have any issues with the refresh, because it's not actually triggering off any API calls in effect. You all you're doing is you're trying to get all your data that you need refreshed first, externally outside of Power BI, get that data loaded into the SQL database, and then you pull the data into Power BI when that data is already refreshed. Hope that makes sense. The other option is you can import flat files like CSV, text, or spreadsheet. You can have multiple connections to flat files, and Power BI will handle it without any issues, I found. So these are the two options of getting over refresh issues, especially when dealing with Power BI service. However, you can't do this with ODBC drivers, because what happens is they're built effectively on the Power Query SDK, which directly interfaces inside Power BI. So these ODBC drivers, they load data directly into the Power BI's data model, so within Power BI. So you can't use ODBC drivers to load into like an SQL database, like multiple connections. You can't use multiple connections and load all that data into a single data set. I hope that makes sense. So there's a problem there. So going on to option 2, so this is why I kind of, if you, I don't want to say that you don't use option 1, because in some circumstances there's definitely you can use option 1, especially if you just want to connect to a single data source. But if you want to connect to multiple data sources, that can present issues with option 1. However, probably the better option is option 2, is you build your own connectors. Now, the way to do this is either if it's a simple API call, you can probably do it in Power Query. And if you Google, make REST API calls with Power Query, there are a lot of articles out there that can teach you how to do this. However, it comes an issue where you're dealing with, say, like something like OAuth 2 authentication, which requires a pop-up window to appear for you to log in. You can't do that in Power Query itself. You'd actually need to build something inside the Power Query SDK. So that's an issue, in my opinion, because you need to know how to code for one thing, or you hire a developer, which is another management issue potentially. You again need to use gateways, because the data is getting pulled into your local machine and then pushed out to the cloud, to Power BI service. Probably not quick to do as well. And again, if you want to interface with lots of different data sets into your PBX model, then it's susceptible to refresh issues. So I've devised a better solution, and it's this. So essentially, what I think is a better solution is you do everything in the cloud. You don't do anything on a local machine. And what I mean cloud, I'm using like serverless technology. So here, you essentially set up serverless technology to make and manage API calls on a schedule, against your whichever app you want to request data from. So this will make your REST API calls, and you'll also manage your OAuth within the cloud. You bring that data back in, and you store that data in the cloud as well, either in a OneDrive, or say like an Azure SQL database, or MySQL, something in the cloud, hosted in the cloud. And then simply all you do then is you connect your Power BI file via direct query or import to that particular data source. So this is really good, because there's no coding involved. So the serverless, the method I use doesn't involve any coding. It's rapid. It's really quick to implement comparatively to, say, programming from scratch. you're not going to have any refresh failures, because what you can do is you can create a single data set in a SQL database and then just directly interface with that. So the refreshes can happen. You're not going to have an issue with refreshes because you can just do a direct query directly to that data set. Or if it's in OneDrive, again, if you store like CSV files into a OneDrive and then just connect your Power BI tool to the OneDrive, it all operates in the cloud, so you don't have to have a local machine running or any gateway set up. It's cheap to do, so the service technology now is quite cheap to do and quite cheap to implement, flexible. And the great thing is about this type of design is that you're decoupling Power BI from actually making the API calls. So all Power BI will then do is just import data. It's not actually triggering off any APIs to be called, which is what you'd previously have done with, say, a Power Query API call. So because you're decoupling these two things from Power BI and the actual API calling, what you are in fact doing is you're creating a single data set of data, and which means is that you don't necessarily have to use Power BI to access this data. You can point Tableau, you can point Excel, whatever BI tool you use, you can just point it to this particular data set here. So it gives you a lot more flexibility, and it's agnostic now for any particular BI tool. So I teach this. I've developed a course. It's learning how to build your own connectors without writing any code, and I give you an introduction into REST and the main key concepts about it, how to read API documentation, and then I give you very detailed walkthroughs covering basic auth, API keys, and OAuth 2, and all the different tools that I use and how I actually implement this for my own business. So if you're interested, before I get to that, so let me just get back into the benefits. So if you're interested in learning about this type of thing, once you learn it, it's a skill you have forever. You potentially build into a niche, BI. So, you can build into a niche for a particular app, so you can become the BI expert for a particular app, because there's no other connector out there, a third-party connector. You could build your own connector and then be the guy that can do BI for this particular app. So that could be quite valuable. The stuff I teach is cheap, like the tools are very cheap, and it's very intuitive. So if you're already a Power BI professional, so you're going to have a logical thinking mind, so you're probably going to pick this up pretty quickly. So I don't think you have to be worried about that. And well, as I said again, you can connect to whatever data source you want. You're not restricted by whatever third-party vendor is going to provide you. So I'm running a special offer until the 31st of Jan. I may extend it depending on interest. And I'm charging, I think, fairly decent price initially. It's just $197. It's a one-off. It will revert to $394 after the 31st of Jan. There is a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if it's not for you, once you start the course and you just find that actually this is not for me, then just message me and I'll give you a refund. But what I do include in the course is actually the connectors that I show you in the actual material. So I go through Zero, which utilizes OAuth 2, MailChimp, which is using basic auth, and then Pipedrive, which is using API keys. And I show you all the intricacies of actually how to make and schedule API calls, how to parse the responses, how to deal with parameters, so and especially say you're getting back paginated data. I go into all of that, and I think it's definitely a skill that if you master, it could really transform your what you're doing as a consultant, or if you're running it as a within a company, it could really transform what you're doing. And you can find the details here at businessautomatorbi.com, and you'll find a link in there to the course. So so hopefully that was useful for you, and if you have any questions, you can contact me. I should have put my email on here, but it's I'll put it in the comments below, my email. Well, I won't do that actually, because I'll get probably spammed. What I'll do is within my website, just if you want to contact me, there's a contact form in there. You can just contact me through that. So yeah, so have a lovely day, and yeah, good luck on your journey.